May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across the continental United States, from the scrublands of Arizona to the pine forests of Georgia, the roar of Pratt & Whitney engines began to fade. At Thunderbird Field near Phoenix, a young flight instructor named Captain James Holloway stood on the tarmac as the sun set behind the mountains, watching a formation of six Texans return from their final training sortie. The air smelled of high-octane fuel and desert creosote. For 4 years, that smell had been the scent of American determination, the invisible architecture of Allied victory. Now, in the golden light of peacetime, it smelled like something else entirely. Like obsolescence. Like the end of an era that had transformed dirt airstrips into the most sophisticated pilot production system the world had ever seen. Captain Holloway didn't know it yet, but he was standing at the edge of a great unraveling. During the war, the United States had constructed the largest military aviation training infrastructure in human history. It was an empire of airfields, a sprawling constellation of bases that stretched from coast to coast, purpose-built to transform farm boys and factory workers into fighter pilots. Between 1940 and 1945, America trained over 193,000 pilots, more than all other combatant nations combined. The numbers themselves told a story of industrial might: 345 primary training fields, 175 basic flight schools, and 63 advanced single-engine and twin-engine combat schools. These weren't makeshift facilities. They were precision-engineered complexes with concrete runways, brick barracks, link trainers, gunnery ranges, instrument labs, and full maintenance hangars. They represented billions of dollars in investment and millions of man-hours in construction. But what happens to an empire when the war it was built to win is over? The men who ran these bases, career officers who had overseen the greatest pilot training surge in aviation history, believed their institutions would endure. They had to. The infrastructure was too valuable, too sophisticated, too necessary for national defense to simply dismantle. Surely the Army Air Forces would recognize that readiness required permanence. Surely the peacetime military would need a steady flow of trained aviators. Surely America had learned the lesson of unpreparedness that had nearly cost it dearly in 1941. They were wrong. Within 6 months of VJ Day, the dismantling began. Not gradually, not thoughtfully, but with the brutal efficiency of a nation desperate to forget the machinery of war. On September 15, 1945, the War Department issued Technical Order 45-9, Deactivation and Disposal of Training Command Facilities. The language was bureaucratic, clinical, betraying nothing of what it actually meant. Base commanders across the country opened the order and read their own obituaries. By December, over 60% of primary training fields had received closure orders. By March 1946, that number climbed to 80%. The speed was staggering. Bases that had taken 18 months to construct were shuttered in 18 days. At Cochran Field in Macon, Georgia, where thousands of fighter pilots had learned aerobatics and gunnery, the last instructor flight occurred on November 3, 1945. By November 20, every aircraft had been ferried out. By December 1, the base was officially deactivated. The link trainers, those blind flying simulators that had saved countless lives by teaching instrument flying, were crated and shipped to storage depots in Texas, where most would never be uncrated. The barracks, still smelling of floor wax and wool uniforms, stood empty. Local newspapers ran photographs of the abandoned control tower with captions about the cost of peace. But it wasn't just about closing bases. It was about what closing them meant. These training fields had been more than military installations. They had been economic engines. Small southern and western towns had swelled with the arrival of Army Air Forces training commands. A place like Chickasha, Oklahoma, population 14,000 in 1940, had watched its economy triple when the AAF opened a basic flying school just outside town. Suddenly there were jobs: mess hall workers, maintenance crews, civilian flight instructors, laundry services, transportation. The base employed over 2,000 people directly and supported another 1,500 indirectly. Local businesses thrived. The town built a new hotel. 3 new restaurants opened on Main Street. Saturday nights, the Officers' Club dance drew half the county. Then, in January 1946, the base closed. 2,000 jobs vanished. The hotel went bankrupt within 6 months. Main Street became a ghost corridor of shuttered storefronts and fading paint. The airfield, with its 3 paved runways and modern hangars, reverted to the county, which had no idea what to do with it. For years, tumbleweeds blew across the taxiways. Across the country, the same story repeated with relentless variation. In Corsicana, Texas. In Bainbridge, Georgia. In Independence, Kansas. The infrastructure remained empty, silent, slowly deteriorating, while the communities that had grown around them withered. The airplanes themselves met similarly unceremonious ends. During the war, the United States had produced over 300,000 military aircraft. Now, in peacetime, the Army Air Forces faced a logistical nightmare: what to do with tens of thousands of trainers, fighters, and bombers that were suddenly surplus. The answer was disposal. Mass disposal. At places like Kingman, Arizona, and Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, enormous aircraft storage and reclamation centers were established. Pilots ferried thousands of planes, many with fewer than 100 flight hours, to these desert boneyards. There, they were lined up in perfect rows stretching to the horizon. Mechanics stripped anything valuable: instruments, radios, engines. Then the smelters arrived. At Kingman alone, over 5,500 aircraft were scrapped between 1946 and 1947. Perfectly functional P-47 Thunderbolts, the fighters that had ruled European skies, were chopped into scrap aluminum and sold by the pound. At 6 Texans, the advanced trainers that had taught dogfighting to a generation of aces, were melted down to make household goods. Eyewitnesses described the scene as apocalyptic: acres of silver wings glinting in the sun, the sound of cutting torches, the acrid smell of burning paint and hydraulic fluid. One former mechanic recalled standing amid the wreckage and weeping. "We built these things," he said years later. "We maintained them. We knew every rivet. And then we just destroyed them." It was more than waste. It was amnesia. A deliberate forgetting. The official rationale was fiscal responsibility. The war had cost $341 billion. The national debt had exploded. Congress and the American public demanded rapid demobilization and dramatic cuts to military spending. "Bring the boys home" was the rallying cry, and it extended to dismantling the apparatus that had trained those boys. Maintaining the training infrastructure was expensive. Keeping bases operational required staff, utilities, maintenance, security. If there was no war, the logic went, there was no need for wartime capacity. But there were voices of warning. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, understood what was being lost. In his final report to the Secretary of War in November 1945, Arnold wrote, "Air power is the dominant factor in modern warfare. Readiness in air power demands not just aircraft and technology, but trained personnel. Training infrastructure is not a luxury of wartime, it is the foundation of preparedness. To dismantle it is to invite future peril." His warnings went unheeded. By the time Arnold retired in March 1946, over half the training bases he had built were already closed or slated for closure. Colonel Robert L. Scott, Jr., the ace pilot and author of "God is My Co-Pilot," was more blunt. In a speech at Maxwell Field in April 1946, he told a room of junior officers, "We're committing strategic suicide. We think we can mothball readiness and pull it off the shelf when we need it. But you can't mothball experience. You can't mothball institutional knowledge. We're losing both, and we'll pay for it in blood." He was prophetic. By 1948, the number of active duty pilots in the U.S. Air Force, now independent from the Army, had plummeted from 243,000 to fewer than 35,000. The training pipeline that had once produced 25,000 pilots per year was producing fewer than 3,000. The advanced bases that remained operational, places like Williams Air Force Base in Arizona and Randolph Field in Texas, were running at a fraction of their wartime capacity. The infrastructure was there, but the institutional momentum had been lost. Flight instructors had returned to civilian life. Maintenance crews had taken factory jobs. The knowledge base that had been so painstakingly built during the war dissolved like morning fog. Then came June 25, 1950. North Korea invaded South Korea. The Cold War turned hot. Suddenly, the United States needed pilots. Combat pilots, fighter pilots, bomber pilots. And it needed them immediately. The Air Force scrambled to recall reservists and reactivate mothballed training bases, but the machinery didn't restart smoothly. Bases that had been closed for 4 years had deteriorated. Runways had cracked. Hangars had been scavenged for materials. Equipment was obsolete or missing. Civilian contractors had to be rehired. Instructors had to be retrained on new aircraft types. The expansion was frantic, inefficient, and costly. Worse, the pilots being rushed through abbreviated training programs weren't as prepared as their World War II predecessors. In the first year of the Korean War, the Air Force lost 142 aircraft to operational accidents, crashes caused not by enemy fire, but by pilot error, mechanical failure, and insufficient training. The butcher's bill for peacetime complacency was being paid in the skies over Korea. At Williams Air Force Base, reopened in a hurry in 1951, a newly assigned flight instructor named Captain Edward Miller found himself teaching advanced fighter tactics in F-80 jets to students who had barely mastered basic flying. "We were pushing them through too fast," he recalled in an oral history decades later. In World War II, a pilot got 400 hours before he went operational. "We were sending guys to Korea with 250 hours and hoping for the best. And we lost people, good people, not to MiGs, but to stalls, spins, and bad decisions under pressure." That's what happens when you dismantle your training infrastructure and then try to rebuild it overnight. The Korean War forced a reckoning. By 1952, the Air Force had reactivated a dozen major training bases and was pouring resources into rebuilding the system that had been so carelessly dismantled. But the reactivation was incomplete. Many of the best wartime sites, fields with optimal weather, terrain, and infrastructure, had been sold to municipalities or private developers and couldn't be reclaimed. The Air Force had to make do with what remained. And what remained was a patchwork. Some bases, like Nellis in Nevada and Luke in Arizona, became permanent fixtures, evolving into the advanced fighter training hubs they remain today. Others cycled through periods of activation and deactivation, their fates tied to the shifting tides of military budgets and strategic priorities. Still others never reopened at all. Their runways became roads. Their hangars became warehouses. Their control towers became relics. In Texas, Goodfellow Field in San Angelo transitioned from pilot training to intelligence training. In Georgia, Turner Field in Albany was eventually absorbed by the city and converted into a municipal airport and industrial park. In Arizona, Thunderbird Field, the very place where Captain Holloway had watched the sun set on VE Day, became a municipal airport and, later, a luxury housing development. Today, streets with names like Pilot Drive and Squadron Lane wind through subdivisions where runways once stretched. The only physical remnant of the base is a small plaque in a neighborhood park, explaining to joggers and dog walkers that they're standing on what was once a crucible of American air power. But the infrastructure wasn't the only thing lost. The culture was lost too. World War II-era training bases had been total institutions. They didn't just teach men to fly, they socialized them into a warrior ethos. The regimen was rigorous and unforgiving. Wake up at 0500. Calisthenics. Ground school. Flight line. Gunnery practice, instrument training, navigation exercises, maintenance briefings, lights out at 2200. The days bled together in a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. Washout rates were high, 30 to 40% in some programs. The men who made it through emerged transformed. They walked differently, talked differently. They had mastered machines that killed careless pilots without hesitation. They had internalized a code, precision, discipline, mutual reliance. That culture was forged not just in cockpits, but in barracks, mess halls, and officers' clubs. It was transmitted through storytelling. The older instructors, combat veterans with DFCs and air medals, shared hard-earned lessons over coffee and cigarettes. They talked about what it felt like when the tracers started coming up, about the importance of checking six, about staying calm when the engine quit at 5,000 feet. That intergenerational transfer of combat wisdom was the invisible curriculum, and it was as vital as anything taught in ground school. When the bases closed and the instructors dispersed, that transmission stopped. By the time the training system ramped back up for Korea, most of the World War II instructor cadre was gone. The new generation of instructors had combat experience from Korea, but there was a gap, a missing cohort. Institutional memory was fractured. Lessons had to be relearned at cost. It happened again after Korea. The training bases contracted in the mid-1950s, then surged for Vietnam in the 1960s, then contracted again in the 1970s. Each cycle of expansion and contraction eroded continuity. Each time, the Air Force had to rebuild what it had allowed to atrophy. Yet amid the wreckage and waste, some things endured. A few of the World War II training bases became legendary. Randolph Field in Texas, known as the West Point of the Air, never closed. It remained the heart of Air Force pilot training, evolving with each generation of aircraft and technology. Williams Air Force Base, though it finally closed in 1993, trained over 26,000 pilots between its reactivation in 1951 and its decommissioning. Luke Air Force Base became the world's premier fighter training installation, graduating thousands of F-16 and F-35 pilots. These bases became more than training facilities. They became mythologies. Pilots who passed through them carried the experience for life. They spoke of the bases with reverence, the way you speak of a forge that tempered you. They remembered the first solo flight, the first formation flight, the first time they broke the sound barrier. They remembered the instructors who pushed them, humbled them, and ultimately certified them as aviators. Those memories became part of their identity, and the towns that hosted the surviving bases came to depend on them. Phoenix's growth in the latter half of the 20th century was inextricably linked to Luke AFB and Williams AFB. The bases brought jobs, federal dollars, and a steady stream of young officers who settled in the area after their service. When Williams finally closed in 1993, the local economic impact was profound, but by then, Phoenix was large enough to absorb it. The runways became part of the Phoenix Mesa Gateway Airport. The land was repurposed, but the memory remained. In other places, the memory faded. In small towns where training bases had been the defining institution for 4 years and then vanished, the forgetting was almost deliberate. There was something painful about remembering what had been and was no more. The elderly residents who had worked on the bases, who had danced at the officers' clubs, who had waved goodbye to young pilots heading overseas, they held on to stories. But as they aged and passed, the stories went with them. The runways cracked and sprouted weeds. The hangars rusted. The wind whistled through broken windows. And the land reclaimed what men had built. There is a particular kind of melancholy in abandoned airfields. Unlike ruined castles or ghost towns, which suggest ages past and romantic decline, abandoned airfields are too recent. Their obsolescence is sudden, brutal, and unsentimental. A place that once hummed with purpose and danger becomes silent and hollow. The runways, designed to launch aircraft into the sky, now lead nowhere. Stand on one of those runways today, say, at the old Hicks Field in Fort Worth, now mostly buried under suburban sprawl, and try to imagine what it was. Picture the cadets running from barracks to flight line in the pre-dawn darkness. Picture the instructors barking corrections over the roar of engines. Picture the formations of trainers lifting off in sequence, banking west toward the practice area. Picture the nervous energy before a check ride, the relief after passing, the devastation after washing out. It's hard. The imagination struggles against the silence. But the silence is deceptive, because what happened at those bases, what they represented, still echoes. They were proof of American capacity. During World War II, the United States didn't just fight on multiple fronts. It built the systems to win on multiple fronts. The training bases were part of that larger industrial miracle, the ability to mobilize, organize, and produce at a scale that enemies couldn't match and allies couldn't imagine. Germany and Japan had excellent pilots, but they couldn't replace losses. By 1944, Luftwaffe training had collapsed under the weight of fuel shortages, Allied bombing, and attrition. Japanese pilot training disintegrated even faster, leading to the desperation of kamikaze tactics. The United States, meanwhile, kept producing pilots. Not just producing them, but producing them well. The training was thorough, the standards high, the resources abundant. That abundance was ideological. It wasn't just about having more, it was about believing that investment in people, ordinary people, could yield extraordinary results. The American pilot training system was predicated on the radical notion that farm boys from Kansas and factory workers from Detroit could be transformed into world-class aviators if given the right training. Transformed into world-class aviators if given the right training, the right equipment, and the right opportunities. It was democratic in a way the Axis systems never were. It assumed potential, not pedigree. And it worked. American pilots weren't inherently superior to their adversaries, but the system that produced them was. By war's end, the United States had achieved air superiority in every theater. Not because its pilots were braver, but because there were more of them, better trained, better equipped, and better supported. The tragedy of the post-war dismantling was that it betrayed that achievement. It treated the training infrastructure as expendable, as something that could be turned on and off like a factory assembly line. But institutions aren't machines. They're living systems. They require continuity, memory, and care. When you dismantle them, you don't just lose buildings and equipment. You lose ethos. You lose expertise. You lose the accumulated wisdom of thousands of people doing hard things well. The Cold War eventually taught the Air Force that lesson, but only after painful mistakes. By the Vietnam era, the training system had stabilized. Bases like Randolph, Williams, and Luke became permanent fixtures, their roles enshrined in doctrine. The Air Force accepted that readiness required constant cultivation, not episodic surge. The pilot production pipeline became smoother, more predictable, more sustainable. But even then, the memory of what had been lost haunted the institution. In the 1970s and 80s, Air Force historians began documenting the World War II training system, interviewing surviving instructors and students, collecting photographs and records. They recognized that a critical chapter of military history was slipping away. Those oral histories, now archived at places like the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base, are treasure troves of detail and emotion. They capture what the dry statistics cannot, the lived experience of building something unprecedented, using it to win a global war, and then watching it dissolve. There is a recurring theme in those interviews. The veterans, whether instructors or students, speak of the bases with a kind of wistful pride. They're proud of what was accomplished, proud of the men who passed through, proud of the victories to which they contributed. But there's also a sense of waste. Not just the waste of scrapped aircraft or shuttered bases, but the waste of potential. What might have been preserved? What lessons might have been retained? How many lives might have been saved in Korea, in Vietnam, in later conflicts, if the institution had maintained continuity? We'll never know. What we do know is this: the rise and fall of America's World War II fighter pilot training bases is a story about more than aviation. It's a story about how nations remember and forget, about how institutions are built and lost, about the tension between wartime necessity and peacetime neglect. It's also a story about hubris. The hubris of believing that what was built in crisis could be safely discarded in calm. The hubris of assuming that readiness is a switch, not a culture. The hubris of treating infrastructure as as objects, rather than as embodiments of knowledge, skill, and sacrifice. The airfields are mostly gone now. Some became airports. Some became industrial parks. Some became neighborhoods where families grill on weekends, unaware that the flat land beneath their feet once launched fighters into combat. The hangars that survive are often repurposed: storage facilities, maintenance shops, aircraft museums. The barracks have been demolished or converted. The control towers stand empty, their windows shattered, their radios silent. But if you know where to look, traces remain. At the Commemorative Air Force Museum in Mesa, Arizona, a restored A-6 Texan sits in a hangar, polished to mirror finish. Its engine still runs. On special occasions, a volunteer pilot, himself a veteran, fires it up and taxis it around the tarmac. The sound is unmistakable, that deep, rattling roar that once filled the skies over hundreds of bases. It's a sound from another era, preserved against forgetting. At Randolph Air Force Base, the Taj Mahal, the iconic administration building with its distinctive tower, still stands as the symbolic heart of Air Force pilot training. Generations of pilots have passed through its halls, and generations more will. It's one of the few unbroken threads connecting the present to the wartime past. And scattered across the country, in small museums and town squares, plaques and monuments mark where bases once stood. They list names of units, dates of operation, numbers of graduates. They're modest memorials, easily overlooked. But they're there, quiet witnesses to a vanished empire. Perhaps that's the most fitting epilogue. Not grand monuments, but small reminders. Because the true legacy of those training bases isn't found in concrete and steel. It's found in the pilots they produced. The thousands upon thousands of men who learned to fly in the skies over Texas, Arizona, Georgia, California, Kansas, and 100 other places. Men who went on to fight in Europe, the Pacific, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Men who came home and became airline pilots, test pilots, engineers, businessmen, fathers, grandfathers. Men who carried with them, for the rest of their lives, the knowledge that they had been part of something extraordinary. That knowledge doesn't decay. It doesn't rust. It passes, in whispers and stories, from generation to generation. So when you see an old airfield, abandoned or repurposed, don't see failure. See what was. See the ambition. See the achievement. See the young men who arrived uncertain and left transformed. See the instructors who shaped them. See the mechanics who kept the planes flying. See the cooks, the clerks, the control tower operators, the townspeople who supported them. See the whole impossible apparatus that America built to win a war and then, in its haste to return to peace, dismantled with barely a thought. And remember, readiness is not a state of being. It's a practice, a discipline, a commitment that must be renewed constantly, deliberately, and with full knowledge of what's at stake. The airfields may be silent now, but their lesson still speaks.